there, and we're good to go. Okay, so if you remember where we kind of left off on Thursday, I talked a little bit about dialogues. I talked about confirmation dialogues and just dialogues in general. The main class we talked in there is about how to use the alert dialog builder, because that's how most of the time you'll end up building and showing a dialog. I also started looking briefly at this set of notes. Copy link, let me share that to Discord. And I kind of mentioned that I want to talk through part of this I talked on Thursday, and then I would mention that I would kind of talk about the rest of it today and break it into two pieces. So where we left off on Thursday is I kind of introduced you to this class that I've written to try and maybe we want to generalize our dialogue logic so that we don't have to embed it everywhere we want to create a dialogue. We maybe create some sort of standardized dialogues that we can reuse. So I created this confirm dialog class. You'll notice, remember, that it's not actually a dialogue, it just contains a dialogue. It's a wrapper for a dialogue. But for all intents and purposes, it kind of can behave as a dialogue because, okay, I can start the dialogue, I can call show, I can call cancel. If I needed to add getters in here, I could add getters and such. And so kind of just a wrapper around the actual alert builder logic, okay? Other things you'll also remember here is I defined my own interface because I needed my own sort of callback methods, right? So we kind of started building that out, and I showed you what that looked like for confirmation dialog. So what I want to talk about today, and this is part of what I'm asking for the lab assignment, is that I want to build a chooser dialog. I want to build a dialog where you can choose from a set of options. So let me maybe start with the lab assignment, and we'll kind of work back from there. So going down to phase 15. Phase 15 is what I want to talk about today. So what I want you to build is a dialog that looks like this. Pops up, you can choose a dialog, you can pick one of those. Actually, I should have put an OK and a cancel button down at the bottom once you're done. Right? So the idea is that dialog pops up, you can pick one or more consoles, and then hit OK and go to the next step. Well, where is that relevant? There's a few places where you might need to pick a console, such as, let's say I'm adding something in my library, at least as it stands at the moment, you're not recording which console do you own that game on. Do you own that game on PC? Do you own that game on Xbox? Do you own that game on PlayStation? We don't really have that data right now, right? But I'd like to incorporate that as another step there. So I add it to my library, and when I do, I say that it's this console. So I need to ask another question. I could implement this as a separate screen, but it would be kind of clunky, right? We could implement this as a separate activity, but that would be not necessarily the best UI. So to kind of keep the simple UI that we have, the idea is you click on the Add to Library button. It's going to pop up and ask you what platform you want, and then add it after you've entered that. Same thing with Add to Wish List. It'll ask you what platform you want, and then save that information, right? So this applies to both the Add to Wish List and Add to Library function. I want to add that ability to choose the platforms, and I also want to, for my users, then be able to choose what consoles they prefer, right? So you maybe go to your profile, go to the My Profile activity, and set your preferred consoles. And then that could potentially influence other things. Now, we're not going to get too much farther into using this because of time constraints, but you could see where, okay, now that I can specify my consoles, well, that can appear on my profile, right? And so I can maybe look for other people to say, oh, you also play on Xbox, let's play together. And it also could be things like, hey, I go to eBay, right? And maybe it automatically picks the consoles that I'm looking for, right? Because I've got, whether it's because I've got, on my profile I've said Xbox, or I've said I want that Xbox game in my wish list, I could potentially just go ahead and pre-select those kind of things. So there are a lot of places where that could kind of be, information could be used if you have it tacked on. right? But really what we're focusing on is how do I build a kind of custom dialogue, if that makes sense, right? So that's what I want to talk about today, is building that dialogue out, and then I'm going to let you figure out the other half of it, right? How do you, when you prompt that, when do you, how do you use the data that comes out of there, etc. But just talking about how do we build the dialogue in the first place, okay? All right. So let's get into my notes here. So there's a few different ways to do this, okay? There's a few different ways to do this. One of the things I mentioned on Thursday is that there's a few methods you can call. You can call set items, you can call set single choice items, and you can also call set multi-choice items. I mentioned that all three of those were available. If you remember set items, you just give it basically a list of strings, a list of char sequences. It will display that list, and without an OK cancel, you just click on an item and it will go and confirm, dismiss the dialog. The second option, let me maybe bring up these as previews. If I go into here. So remember, we can kind of take this approach. We can also do checkboxes. We can also do radio buttons, right? So all three of those are kind of available to you. I'm going to start with the simple case, right? I'm going to start by talking about, what would happen if we just did this, and we're going to kind of work it through and show some ways that we might enhance them. I'm also going to talk about why we might not want to use this particular, because I think that in this case, I would rather have you do it a slightly different way. We'll kind of work our way to that. All right. So step one, let's talk about a very, very simple version of this, right? This is using the set items call, okay? So if we look at what's going on here, we start at the dot, we call this the name chooser dialog, right? So this is implementation version 1. You're just choosing a name or choosing a string, right? So the constructor takes a few arguments. It takes a context, it takes a title for the dialog, it takes an array of char sequences, which are the names that you're picking from, and then finally there's a callback called onChoose, which is where we're going to call once the user made the selection. Make sense? Right? So kind of the overarching setup. So I'm just saying, what can the user take? The reason I'm saying char sequence in both of these cases for the title and the names is because that's actually the arguments that the alert builder takes, meaning that you can, not only can you put a string in there, you can also put formatted text in there. So if you wanted to make something bold, etc., then you can do that. One quick mention, just in terms of hierarchy, because it's been a while since we did this. You'll remember that there are a few different kinds of things that are considered char sequences. So char sequence. When we're talking about that, that includes strings. A string is a char sequence. A string builder is not a string, but it is a char sequence. And an editable is also a char sequence. So all three of those are char sequences. Editable, remember, is what you get if you call get text on a text view or an edit text. Mm-hmm. That's technically because there's a little bit more to this. Editable is kind of a blend of string builder, but also supports formatting as well. So you can also have formatting in an object like this, or you might have formatting that you've defined in your resources using, say, the B tags or the I tags, etc. You could potentially format your text. Cool. So that's why these are char sequences instead of just being strings. Okay? That just makes it more general. Okay. Other than that, you can just kind of think of the char sequence anywhere you see char sequence, just pretend it says string. And it will work if you put a string in there, because strings are char sequences. Okay? So first thing I do, I'm going to go ahead and save that to a variable. I've got a place for it here. The reason I do that is I might want to ask for it at some point. So like I might want to have a getter here to say get names at a later point in time. So let's go ahead and save it to a variable so we have it around in case we need it later. Next thing, let's go ahead and build the dialog. I'm going to set the title, I'm going to set the items, and then finally I'll create it. So it's kind of just like we saw with the confirmation dialog. I call whatever setters I want to set up the dialog, we create it, and then we've got this show and cancel methods here, so you can show it, you can create it, create the dialog, you can show it, or you can cancel to dismiss it, right? Little thing to pay attention to here for the callback. Notice the callback is passed to set items, and so when the user picks an item, I call that callback with two things, which tells me the index that they chose from the list. So I'm passing that as the index here, and I'm also passing the particular name that they clicked on by using that array that we had previously. So I'm passing both basically the index of it and the actual value. Because depending on your situation, you may want both of those things. So again, trying to keep things more general. Okay? Does that make sense so far? So that's a pretty simple setup, right?
That's
so
only going to make a dialog with text, right?
Yeah, that's just going to make a dialog with text, exactly. So if I need to pop up something like that, which I can pull up my example project and show what this does real quick. I've got a few different versions of the chooser here, so you can see 4 versions that I've already implemented. And if I pop up, that's what this is going to look like, right? So I've got Fred, I've got Joe, I've got Mo. I can click back to just dismiss the dialog and nothing happens. Similarly, I could just click out here, dismiss it. So remember that there's a few ways to cancel this. But I can click on, say, Joe, and you can see I've got a post popping up just to confirm, okay, yes, we got Joe back in the callback, right? So this is what that looks like, right? So there's some limit. So this is a really good start, right? It gives you a kind of understanding of the basics of what needs to be there to kind of make your own chooser, to make your own picker, right? What are some of the limitations here? What are things that this can't do? Yeah.
It won't let you put like images for each item.
Right, I can't put any images in here. I'm strictly limited to text. What else? How is this different than what we want to build in the end?
You can only choose one.
We can only choose one, right? So I'm limited to, I can only have text, I can only choose one, and I can, I also can't, another thing that's worth noting, I can't have these horizontally oriented. They do have to be vertical. It only works if you have a very small number of options. This is not something you want to do if you have 100 different names to choose from. It's good for a small number of names. Yeah.
Maybe this can be resolved adding a 4th item, but currently you can't choose no preference?
Right. You can't choose no preference. I could put that in, right? So I do have the flexibility to pass in an array of names, and I could just pass in one of those as no preference. That's fine, right? I could just pass in another string and say, hey, index 0 or index 4, I could put it at the beginning or the end, and I could do that. I could resolve that. But yeah, I don't really have an out-of-box solution for that, but I could do that without needing to change the code of the name chooser dialog. Make sense? So I want to enhance this a little bit to add some more features. I also might want to have an OK and cancel button, especially if I need that option of selecting nothing, or if I need that option of selecting multiple things. Both of those cases are cases where I need an OK and cancel. So back to my notes. Let's talk about how we can enhance this a little bit. Okay. The first thing I'm actually going to do before we jump into those things is notice that what we take is strictly a list of care sequences, right? I have to previously pre-process this into that list of names. I can't just give it a list of objects, right? A list of things. Like it might be people that I want the user to select or consoles that I want to select. So really I want to be able to pass in not an array of care sequences, but ideally a list of objects, right? So here I've got another one. This is a little bit improved. I'll call this the thing chooser dialog, right? And so here I'm selecting from things, whatever those things are, right? So here, instead of taking an array of care sequence, I'm taking a list of things. So things is whatever class I've defined. Let's say in this case, the thing has a icon and it has a name, and that's all the data that's in there. But there could be additional data in there, and that part doesn't matter so much. So I'm going to take that as my argument here. I need to do a little bit of extra processing. So I'm going to make two variables. I'm going to be storing the list of things itself, as well as a list of names or an array of names, because I have to get it into an array of names for the set items call. Does that make sense? For the set items call, it needs to be an array of names. So let's do a little bit of pre-processing. So I'm going to map, I'm going to go through, and I'm going to turn that array of things into an array of strings, basically. Take their names and copy that over. Commonly in JavaScript, we would just do that with a map. So like if I was doing this in JS, I could probably just go, hey, let's take our things, and I would say, let's call things.map, and I would go do something like this. Take it, x.name. So if I was writing JavaScript, this is how I would solve that very problem. I would just use the map function, right? Historically, Java hasn't had this built in there. Part of that is this kind of implies and is normally used with a Lambda function, right, which is a relatively new addition to JavaScript. There is a way to do this with the Streams API. There's a newer way as of Java 8 to actually do this kind of map in JavaScript. But for now, I'm going to be simple and do it the old-fashioned way and just use a loop. Right? So this comes up a lot of times, so that's why I want to mention it. So first things I'm going to do, I'm going to save some variables. I'm going to save this variable n, which represents the size of the original items list, because I need to know how big it is. I'm going to use that for a few things. I'm going to save the items to an array, to the instance variable items, and I'm going to create a new array called care sequence and save that as name. So now I have a list and an array, and they're both the same length. Make sense? Cool. So I basically have parallel arrays on this step, right? Then I just need to loop through each of the things one by one. Ask for I say items.get, which remember will give me the x or ith item in there, and then ask for the name of that thing, right? So we're assuming that the thing has some sort of method called getName. So I call getName, gives me back name. I save that. At the end of that, I've got an array. So then I can just pass that in again, as I did with set items, and then call onChoose. I'm going to do a little bit differently, because what I want now, rather than passing to the callback, rather than passing the name back, I'd rather pass the thing itself, right? So my onChoose, instead of being an index in a care sequence, is now an index in a thing, right? An index in an item. That I want to change my callback to be that, because that would be more useful. Make sense? So a little bit of refactoring there, and now this is going into items instead of going into names. Cool. So quick transition. It's worth mentioning that because if you're looking at the docs for Alert Dialog, you might find that all of the APIs, all the endpoints there, only take arrays. There's actually no endpoint on the alert builder that takes a list, so that's what you got to do, is just map it from, hey, I want to map it from a list. I'm going to create an array with it, and that's how I would do that, is manually creating it. Cool. There's not an easy, like here, I'm going to call toArray and convert it over to something else, that kind of approach. Cool? Okay. Next, let's improve this a little bit more. So what I would like to do from here is that will step me up into, I think if I go back to, let me go back to here, to my running example. So that's name chooser 1. Here's name chooser 2. basically looks the same way. It's just I'm providing it basically a list of movies instead of a list of strings, right? Instead of a list of names, I can give it a list of objects. Other than that, it's the same in terms of the user behavior. From there, the next thing I'd like to do is step up to this, where I can actually have an icon plus a name. Now, I think that my icons are not appearing because of issues with my emulator, so Picasso should be downloading those, but it's not doing it at the moment. So you can kind of see what I'm trying to get to, though. Right? I'm trying to have an icon next to the name. Okay? So in order to do that, in order to make that transition, what I need to be able to provide is, instead of just providing a list, I need to provide some sort of adapter. Okay? And specifically, the alert dialogs, what's built out of there, is actually, it's worth mentioning, uses a list view and not a recycler view. Okay? It's based on, this list is based on a list view, not based on a recycler view. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, list view is kind of the ancestor or the thing before that came before we actually had recycler view. Right? It used to be the thing that we use everywhere we wanted to show a list. We used to use list views. Now we've migrated over to using recycler views. Okay? So the APIs are a bit different, right? Because the objectives and the age of these things is different. So when I was working with list views are constrained in a few places. They're not that efficient with working with large lists. Okay? So for instance, if I have a list view that's rendering 1,000 things, more than likely you can assume that you're rendering all 1,000 of those things. There are some ways to optimize it a little bit, but more than likely you'll be having 1,000 things on screen, whereas the recycler view tries to optimize it and only show or render the things that are actually on screen, right? There's a little bit of recycling going on, but not to the same extent that recycler view does. Cool? So for instance, the recycling that list view does do is if I replace the underlying array, then it will reuse the views, but populate them with new data. So you still effectively are creating 1,000 view holders rather than creating 5 view holders. You're just reusing those next time you change the data underlying the adapter. That means, one of the things that inherently means, I said that these dialogues are not really good for rendering a lot of things. I wouldn't want to render 1,000 things in a dialogue like this, right? Because it's using list view and not using recycler view. Okay. Now, with a custom layout and not using any of these built-in things, I could use a recycler view on this dialogue. That is totally possible. I could use a recycler view here instead of a list view. But why don't I want to do that? Well, the reason I don't want to do that is because this dialogue really kind of only makes sense if there's a small number of items. If there are large enough items in this list that you need a recycler view, it really just should be a separate activity. It shouldn't be a dialogue, right? Dialogues are supposed to be small with a small number of options. Does that make sense, everybody? Mm-hmm. So while it is possible to put a recycler view in here, I don't want to. I want to use the list view because it should be a small number of items. But that does mean we have a little bit of a different API to learn if we want to use an adapter here for the list view. Okay. Yeah.
Because it has its own adapter built in there.
Yeah.
Does that mean you can throw a fragment in there instead?
What do you mean you can put a fragment in there?
Well, it tells me it's the dialogue itself is kind of an activity, is it not?
Not
really.
Not really.
Okay.
Is really just views as it stands here typically. Although I think that I'm not entirely clear how it works today, because you'll notice the kind of gray background and it overlaying the thing before. So I'm not entirely sure if the way it's doing that right now is with views, but by this suspicion, so notice that if I hit back arrow and that does something, that wouldn't be possible, I know that for sure, if it was just views. because the on back pressed event, remember, goes to where? It goes to the activity, right? So that means inherently that alert dialog, at least today on modern devices, includes either a fragment or it's an activity that's inherently happening there. I don't know which. But inherently to there are some things happening there. I think that that's a fragment. I think that there's already a fragment that's happening there. Because otherwise that back wouldn't work. Cool. The gotcha, so basically what I want to do is I want to go over here and use an adapter to turn my things, my list of things, into a list of views, right? So basically what I need to provide here is a list adapter rather than providing a recycler view.adapter is what we created before, right? So it's got a little bit of a different interface, but a similar sort of approach to it. Make sense? Okay, so let's talk about the class itself first and talk about how that fits in, and then we'll talk about how I build that adapter out. So one of the things I'm transitioning in here is look at the class name, adapter chooser dialog T. Okay, the previous one that I did only took things, like the thing class, thing chooser dialog. If I wanted a person chooser dialog, I would need to make an entirely new dialog to support this. Okay, so this one that I built here is generic. That's what the T represents. There's a type argument, right? So if I want this to be for things, I pass in thing there. If I want that for persons, I pass in person. If I want this for movies, it can be movies, right? So that's the type of thing that we're representing, right? So it's more general than the previous example. So what we're going to take in the constructor now, we're still taking the context and the title. That hasn't changed. What has changed is two things. We're taking a different callback and we're passing in an array adapter T instead of a list T. Make sense? Or a list of things. Okay? So this T here, you'll notice I have that two places. That T is going to be the same as what's ever defined at the top of the class. Right? So the top of the class says T. This will be that same T. Okay? It's kind of like a type variable, right? I've got a variable name there. I'm going to save the adapter. And then in here, I'm going to call set single choice items. Set single choice item takes the adapter. It takes an index for what's selected. So I'm passing in -1. I'm just saying, hey, let's not select anything by default. So -1. And then I got my callback in here where I'm calling back my onChoose callback, but also notice in here I'm saying dialog.dismiss. Okay. Now the previous example I didn't do that because set items, that callback automatically dismisses the dialog. Okay. So here, because set single choice items, that's for showing a radio button, doesn't automatically dismiss. Okay. So if I want to dismiss as soon as the user picks an item rather than by picking OK, I need to dismiss it in there. Does that make sense? Now, it's worth mentioning that there's two functions on your dialogues that look very similar. There's a cancel and there's a dismiss. There's a cancel and there's dismiss. They're slightly different. Okay. So dismiss makes the dialogue go away. Cancel also makes the dialogue go away. The difference being, dismiss will call your cancel callback, or sorry, dismiss will not call your cancel callback. Cancel will call your cancel callback, right? So it's the expectation is if you're calling cancel, it's like the user pressed cancel and you don't want to take the action. If you're saying dismiss, you're saying make the dialogue go away. But in this case, I also want the dialogue to the procedure to proceed. Make sense? So I'm not canceling the dialogue. I'm just dismissing it because we were successful. Okay. User picks something. So then my interface looks like this. Public interface on choose listener. You'll notice this one is generic again. Unfortunately, I have to, for a nested interface like this, you have to define the type arguments again. So typically this T may or may not be the same as that T up there. It's contextual. So whatever T I've got inside of the interface is this T right here. But because of how I pass this in, this is basically ends up being they're the same T. But technically they may or may not be. Okay. So to define it again, we say, hey, there's a T. This takes an index and an item. So it's almost the same thing as on the previous example. It's just generic instead of specifically saying it has to be a thing. Make sense? Generics are really, really helpful when you're trying to build something that you can reuse. Okay? Now, this is more general. The one I'm actually asking you to build, I don't expect to have generics because the only thing you're picking is consoles. Right? So it doesn't necessarily need to have that, but you can understand why I might want to do this so that I don't have to write a bazillion of these things, right? That way I only have to write an adapter for each thing. I don't have to write a dialog for each thing, for each class. Okay. All right. Let's talk about how we populate it with data. So in order to populate it with data and to make this dialog appear, okay, what I'm going to start by doing is I'm going to create a list of items. So here I've got a list of things. I'm going to construct it whatever way I want to choose. I could get that from the database. I could get that from a REST API like eBay. I could get that from anywhere, right? I could get it from a file, etc. Or I could just hard code it, right? Which is what I've done in the example code. So I create the list. I then need to create an adapter. So here I'm creating a thing chooser adapter. So you can kind of see that's specific. It only works with a list of things. That adapter I'm constructing with two things, context and items. Context and the list of items. Then I go down to create the dialog. So here I'm saying adapter chooser dialog thing, right? So there's the type argument that we saw in the class. I'll construct it with the context, its header, pass in the adapter, and also pass in my callback of whatever I want it to do, right? So once the user picks something, then onChoose thing is going to get called with the index and the thing that the item the user picked. Make sense in terms of using it? Okay. The part that's still outstanding here is how I build that adapter. Okay. So one of the things you'll remember here is that I said that it has to be an array adapter T. Okay. So that inherently means whatever adapter I create has to be a subclass of array adapter. Right? I'm not saying it has to be specifically array adapter, but it can be array adapter or anything that's a subclass of array adapter. Okay? So the way that we implement these kind of adapters is I'm going to implement or extend array adapter thing. Right? So I'm specifically saying this works with things. It's similar to how you created the recycler views. Right? It was a recycler view.adapter, and then what was in the brackets was the class for the view holder, not the class for the thing that you were representing, right? So rather than it being like adapter person, it was adapter person view holder, right? But similar sort of setup. Remember, this is a kind of an ancestor of our recycler view adapters, right? So this kind of predates it, okay? First, I've got a constructor. We'll come back to the variable there a second. The constructor takes two things. It takes a context, and it takes a list of items. Very similar to how we set up our recycler views. They take a context and a list of things. Or you might call set items later. Either way, you can do that, right? So first thing, I need to call the superclass. The superclass requires a little bit of extra, the superconstructor requires a little bit of extra information here. So we need the context. It needs a layout for the items. So here I've created an item option layout already. So I'm going to use that. And it also needs an ID for where the text view is in that layout that renders the actual label. Okay. So there in that layout, I've got an image view and I've got a text view. And so this is the ID of that text view. Okay. because out of the box array adapter already knows kind of how to render a list of strings. Okay. So we're gonna pass that in. Last argument is the items itself. So call the super constructor. That part is actually really, really important. Okay. There's a lot of nuance in what's happening, but that part's really important. Next thing I need to do is I need to go ahead and get an inflator. Just like I did with the recycler view, layout inflator from, use the context, that'll give me back my inflator. Okay. The reason I need that is I'm going to be, in a second here, I'm going to be inflating those option layouts, those item layouts into actual views. So I need that. Kind of like if we look at the recycler view, I created the inflator in the constructor, and then in onCreate view holder, I used that inflator. Okay. Now, difference in recycler view versus these list views. Okay. In recycler view, remember we have a few methods we need to implement: get item count, on create view holder, and on bind view holder. Okay. There's no get item count method here. The way it gets the item count is by that last argument that I passed to the constructor. It takes that, it's actually owning the list itself and implementing get item count for you, right? So it's taking care of that part for you. That also means I can't handle the null case. Just a fair forewarning, if you've got null in here, this will crash because it won't be able to create the adapter because array adapter doesn't support null. There's also only one method here after that, getView. So getView is kind of a blend of you're doing the things that we would normally do in onCreateView and on bindView. It's both of those things put together. Because this is before we figured out, oh, we should separate those things. Recycler View said, oh, if we want to reuse these things, I need to create them and bind them and make that two separate operations. So ListView doesn't do that. Okay, so this method that we're going to see, getView, is kind of a combo of those two. Okay, so it takes three arguments: a position, the second argument is a view called ConvertView, and the last one, view group parent. Okay, so talking those kind of in backwards direction, the parent is basically the container that your views are your items are gonna end up in, right? That's actually typically the linear layout that's contained inside of the list view. The view, that second argument, okay, that's kind of the view that's being recycled. So if you had previously had a view on screen that you were using to render that item, ConvertView will be the old view, which you can use to bind to new data. If you're constructing this initially when you create the adapter, initially when it shows stuff, all of those convert views will be null. The first time this goes through, all of those convert views will be null. So that's the thing you have to pay attention to, right? It may be null, it may not be null. Okay, so effectively, if it's null, you have to do the create view holder part. If it's not null, then you just have to do the bind part of it, right? So depending on that, whether it's null or not, you're doing create and bind or just bind. Okay. So first things first, I need to figure out what's here. So I'm going to start by creating a variable, call it item view. I'm going to check if the convert view is null or not. So if it's not null, then we're just going to use it. We're just going to say, hey, you've already created the view. Previously, it's already been on screen, so we're just going to reuse it. Say convert view is equal to, save it to item view. In the case where we don't have convert view, where it's null, then I'm going to use that inflator to inflate my item layout, pass in the parent, pass in false because we don't want to attach at this point, and that's going to inflate it, right? So whether or not convert view is there determines whether or not we inflate. Does that make sense to everybody? Determines whether or not we inflate. So this is the part, this is the part where we're kind of in the onCreate view holder sort of part of it. Okay. From there, regardless of whether I'm using one that's being reused or if I'm using one that's brand new, I want to find the relevant child views that we care about. So I'm going to say item view find the ID. I'm going to find the option, the text view, and I'm also going to find the image view and pull those into variables, right? So what we see here, if you're thinking and comparing this to recycler view, that's your onCreate view holder, is right there. This other part is where I bind the data. That's my onBind, right? That's the other half of it, okay? So here, I'm going to grab the position, which it told us what position we're in as that first argument. So we grab that. I can grab some data off of here. So I'm saying, let's grab the name of the item and the URL for the item. Okay? Name and URL. Just assume I have names and image URLs. I'm then going to put that in, and I'm going to say, okay, if it's null, we'll go ahead and we'll show an error message there instead, say, hey, the name's missing. Others will show it. Similarly, if the URL's there, not there, I'll just show a broken image, say, hey, there's a missing image. Otherwise, I'll use Picasso to load the image in. Okay, we found the data, the name of the icon, we can return the ID, and we're done. And that's the end of the adapter, right? So implementing these array adapters isn't that hard. It's in some ways a lot of very similar to how you did the recycler views. It's just a little different because the two methods, onCreate and onBind, are kind of meshed together into one getView function. Cool? Okay, so that gives us an adapter, and that can then give us the kind of thing that we have. So if I go back to my here, and this is also a similar one where I've got genres I'm picking from. Both of these you're using that kind of array adapter approach. Make sense? Right? Okay. So that's kind of what's baked in, right? Those are the things you can do with what's baked in. Is you can have a vertical list of things. We create an adapter, then we can customize what that layout looks like. Okay. What's missing from this stuff? From what our destination is. So if we compare that to what we want to build, what I want to work down to is this. What I like to do is render the list of consoles this way. Okay? Make it more compact, right? Because it turns out it's like, well, actually the icon's good enough. I don't really need some text to go with it. I can just make a button. The icon, that's obvious enough. The other thing I want to be able to do is have multi-select where potentially you could pick more than one console, right? So maybe you tap on Windows, it sort of highlights it, shows you that it's checked, and then you have an OK and a cancel button you can click on the bottom to say, okay, yes, proceed with adding it to my library, my wish list, or cancel and I don't want to have it. Does that make sense? Does that kind of follow? So how do I get from here to there? Yeah.
So do we need something other than an alerts dialog?
I can still do this with an alert dialog.
Okay, this okay?
Yeah. I can still do this with an alert dialog. Okay. So one of the things to recognize here, that list view can only be rendered vertically. Recycler view does give us that layout manager, and we can choose to lay things out horizontally or vertically, but there's no layout manager with list view. That was a very nice addition with recycler view, to be able to have horizontal lists. In fact, the way that we used to do this, because I had to do this for one particular project, is what you did was you would turn the list view on its side, you would rotate it 90 degrees. All these things here would be, so you rotate it on its side, and then you ended up having to rotate all the items as well because they would be at 90-degree angles. So there is a way to do it with list view. It just is convoluted because you have to rotate and then unrotate. I think this is actually backwards. Because it'd be rotate one way and then rotate back the other way. So it is possible to do that, it's just really painful. So that's not what I want to do. Okay. So one of the things that I mentioned on Thursday is remember that there's a set view function. There's a set view function on the alert the alert dialog builder, and I talked about how you could do a custom layout. You remember this example? So here we defined our own layout and put it into the content area. That's what we would need to do for this case. Does that make sense? So rather than taking the adapter approach and the list view approach, you want to take this sort of approach and blend it together. Questions? Does that kind of make sense? So I want to do a little bit of live coding with kind of troubleshooting how we can get here with the things we know so far, and maybe figure out how we can kind of build this and implement this and try to get to what we want to do.
Did you say set items was what's the name of the method?
This is set view.
Set view. Okay.
Yeah, we use set view here. And so that's what they have, this custom login dialog, right? So what I want to do is build that. Okay. I'm going to be doing this in the customs dialog project. That's where I had started making this example. So I'm going to code along here. If you want to code along, or if you're following along, you can do that in your own project. And you can either do that in the movie list, or you can do that in the game library project. But what I want to try and do is do it in here. Okay? So let's think about where we need to start. So remember, with all of these, where I've started is I've started with a dialog class, basically. I created a brand new class, and that's been kind of my container for the thing I want, right? So here, let's say I'm going to create a new Java class, and I'm going to call this something like console chooser dialog. Okay. Now remember, this doesn't extend anything. This isn't actually a dialog. It's just going to contain a dialog. Okay. It's not actually a dialog. It's just going to contain one. So in all of those examples, what was the very first thing that I put in the top of this class? In all of the examples from the lecture notes, what was the first thing I did?
The dialog that we're wrapping, right?
Right. So I have a reference to that object, right? Okay. So private alert dialog. And I made that final because we're going to construct it in the constructor, and then it will never change. Okay. The next place I would start looking is the constructor, right? So I need to make a constructor here. Public console chooser dialog. What are the arguments to this constructor? What are the things we need? Again, look at the code examples. What are the things we need to be able to construct this dialog? Yep. Context, right? So that's pretty normal. I need a context. And you remember, for kind of making this easier to debug and work with, I did mark these as nullable or non-nullable, right? So is this context optional? It's not optional because I couldn't do anything if I didn't have it. So this is non-null. Okay? What's the next argument? what's the next piece of information that we need to construct this dialog?
So are we going to go straight to building the solution that we want, or are we going to incrementally get to that one?
I would start with the solution that we want,
Okay.
right?
So then we don't really need a title then.
Well, do I need a title, right? Should this dialog have a title? Remember, I did mention on Thursday that not every dialog needs to have a title. Okay, get a hand up. Do I have one in the mock-up? Okay, I have one in the mock-up. Why would this dialog need a title? Well, because it's going to be a custom content layout, right? So typically, if I have something in here that's not just a simple message, like with the confirmer dialog, it typically should have a dialog. It should have a title to explain what's going on underneath. So this should definitely have a title. Okay? Next question. Is that title going to be the same every time this dialog pops up?
No.
Okay? No. You say no. Why not?
Well, are we making a generic one here, or are we going to make one that's...
So I want to be able to use it. If you look back at the lab assignment, what are the contexts that we want to be able to pop this dialog up? There's 3 contexts in here. What's going to make this dialog appear?
When they add an item to the library,
Yep. Add it to the wish list.
add it to the wish list,
And third,
on their profile.
on their profile. Okay? So I have some options, right? I could have the same title in all 3 of those places, or I could have a different title in all 3 of those places. Okay? So I could, if I say it's going to be the same, then I don't necessarily need to have the title as an argument to this class, right? If it's always going to be the same, then I don't really need to pass it as an argument. I might as well just hard code it into my class. But if it's going to be different in all of those 3 places, I probably want it as an argument. Does that make sense? So, in those 3 contexts, would it make sense for the title to be different? Yeah, probably, right? If I'm just looking at this dialog, then it doesn't tell me am I adding it to the wish list or am I in the library. I might want to incorporate that information into the title, right? So I probably want the title to be a parameter so that I have the option at least of changing it based on where the dialog pops up. And again, I'm going to leave that as a char sequence so that we could potentially format it. So for instance, I might say, hey, this is wish list and maybe highlight wish list in bold, right? Or this is library, let's highlight library in bold. This is profile, let's highlight profile in bold. So I might want to do a little bit of formatting on that title. What else do I need? What arguments do I need to this? For what I'm trying to achieve. Again, look at the lab assignment. What parameters do I need to this? Yeah.
I'm guessing like a list of consoles or platforms.
List of consoles, maybe. Okay. So that's one option. If I take a list of consoles, okay, then I kind of would expect it to grow and shrink based on the consoles that are available, right? The problem is kind of inherently because I want to add some buttons and I want to have a layout, I want to avoid doing a whole recycler view or list view here. I'm just going to hard code in the layout as having, say, 4 buttons or 5 buttons or whatnot. I kind of have to have a presumption of what the consoles are, right? So if I say there's 4 options, I'm going to kind of hard code those 4 options into here, okay? So keeping that simple. I'm going to presume I know the consoles already ahead of time.
So then you want us to pass a size or something?
I want to pass a what?
The size, the number?
What do you mean number?
Well, you were saying something about how the consoles could change. So you want us to presume, you want us to know already.
I'm going to say let's code this dialog as if, say, hey, there's 4 consoles, right? So in this example, right, I've got Windows, I've got Xbox, I've got PlayStation, I've got Switch, Nintendo Switch. And so I'm going to just say, hey, let's build it as if those are the only consoles that are available, right? Okay. So rather than trying to have that part by dynamic, I'm going to make that part static, okay? Now, even though I've given you that presumption, right, that there's always X number of consoles, there's always 4, is it true that every game is available for all of those consoles? No, right? So I need to know which consoles are actually available, and what I want to do is disable the buttons that aren't available in that context. Does that make sense? So if you're, say, adding a game that's only available on PC, then the only button that should be enabled would be the PC button, okay? If it's adding it to your profile, well, that's going to be all consoles, right? Okay? So I need some way to represent the available or supported consoles. Right? Well, what's that type?
So can that not be a list? It would just be potentially a shorter list?
Okay. So a list of...
Or an array, you know, depending on if we're setting an object or a
yeah.
literal data.
Let's presume a list is easier than working with an array.
Okay.
But list of what? List of what? You said strings? Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's say list of strings. What would be those strings? Or like the ID of the consoles, right?
Oh, yeah.
Basically, you're saying those would be the IDs of those consoles, right? Like think of how you set up the consoles collection. That would be the keys, the document IDs in there.
Oh, you're talking about Firebase ID.
Right, that's one way I could do this, right? Just say, hey, just give me the list of consoles that are supported, okay? Now, where am I going to get this data, though, right? Let's say I'm pulling this data from the game, and I want the supported consoles from the game. How did we store that in the database? How did we store the supported consoles per game in the database?
Mine was a map of strings.
Right, which is how I directed most people to do it, right? I could have stored it in the database this way, right? And if I had done that, then I would probably accept that and stop there. But in reality, what we did is we stored them as a map, right? We stored them as a map because inherently there's some benefits to doing it that way, okay? And specifically, we stored it as a map from strings to booleans, right? I want to accept it this way. That way I don't have to do a big translation from how we've stored it in the database to the data that I need to bring this dialog up, right? That way I can just say game.consoles and pass the consoles.
So what if you already had it stored as like a boolean?
What do you mean stored as a boolean?
Because I had my console stored as a map of booleans, and that's how I copied
That's exactly what I have on board.
it. Okay.
That's exactly what I have it for. So it's a map of strings and booleans.
Okay.
It's the key, right? The key, the thing that's on the left, is a string.
Okay, I
The
see.
value is a boolean. The key is a string, the value is a boolean. So this is the way that we've stored it in the database. So it's much more convenient to pass it in this way. Okay? Should this be allowed to be null, or should it always be non-null?
The map itself.
The map itself.
Okay. It has to be at least one console, right?
You said what,
It has to
potentially?
be at least one console, right?
Okay.
It's-
Remember, what are the contexts that I need this dialog to pop up in? Add to library, add to wish list, and my profile. Okay.
So based on your context, there will never be a situation in which you're trying to add something where you can't choose one, at least one,
Okay. Ideally.
unless the game is incomplete in the database. Of course.
Yeah. The database, it could be incomplete in the database, right? It could be that I set up a game and there's no map telling me what consoles it's there available for yet. It could be that that map itself in the database might be null, right? That's actually a possibility. Okay, so that's one possibility. Is in the database it could be null. Okay. The other possibility, if let's think about the user, right? What consoles are supported for a user? Well, a user can pick any console. And in fact, there's nowhere where I'm storing the supported consoles for users. So it would make sense for users that I can pass null as this argument, and null means that every console is available. Does that make sense? If I don't know which consoles are supported, let's just pass null and say anything goes. Does that make sense? So I'm going to allow this thing to be nullable, and that's how I want you to treat it. I want you to treat it as if it's null, then all consoles are allowed. Okay. Remember, I also want to be able to do multi-select, okay? And so I may want to come in here and also know which consoles were selected previously, right? So I might store in the database after the user picks, say, their preferred consoles. The next time the user pops this up, I want it to show the consoles that they picked previously. I don't want it to just clear out their choices and have to pick them all again. So I need that data, right? So let's call that the selected consoles. Okay? Selected consoles. What type is this? What type is that? Well, we've got another fork in the road. We can actually do this as a list, or we can do it as a map. We haven't really stored it yet, right? We haven't stored the selected consoles yet to the database, so we are free to choose. But which of those options would be easier? Well, if we think about, storing it as a map versus storing it as an array, right? If I store it as a map, it's probably going to work really well with the code that's already there, that's already operating on it as a map. Okay? I'm not going to have to write a bunch of additional code because now sometimes I'm dealing with an array and sometimes I'm dealing with a map. Okay? The other thing that happens and makes it really, really easy is that I can add and subtract and remove things from a map just by going to its key, versus if I use an array, then I have to go loop through it, say, hey, I'll remove Xbox from the list, so I have to figure out where Xbox is in the list, and then remove it, and then figure out how to update the UI, versus accessing and manipulating this as a map is very easy, because I can just use get and set based on the ID of that particular console. So what I would recommend doing is the same thing we did with the supported consoles, and let's say that's, again, a map. So we've got a map for the consoles that are supported, and we've got a map for the consoles that are selected. I'm going to allow this to be null, null meaning nothing's been previously selected. Does that make sense? So null here means in supported means everything's available. Null in selected means nothing's been previously selected. Does that make sense, the combination of those two maps? Because they're going to kind of come from different sources and represent different things. Okay. But that makes it very easy to use it in both contexts, right? If it's the selected, it's either going to come from the library or it's going to come from the profile, depending on, or the wish list, depending on where I bring this up from. Okay. Are there any other arguments that we need here? What was the last thing in all the examples that we did?
So, right, so if we're going to put the images on the screen, we don't really have that yet, right?
Okay. Well, let's just say I do.
Okay.
Let's just say I do. Don't need to worry about that. If you look at all the examples, what was the last argument to that constructor for the dialog?
On choosing.
Was the callback specifically, right? So I had called that in all of those cases. I called that like my on choose. What did I call it? I think I called it my on choose listener.
Mm-hmm.
I created a different one for these different cases. So we'll call it on choose. Okay. I have to be careful about the hit escaping so that stays red. I do want that to stay red on choose listener because I haven't implemented it yet. So we need to implement it. Okay. So I would jump down to the bottom of the class, public interface on choose listener. Okay. I need one function, so I'm going to call void. I'm going to call this on choose, and let's say it takes the consoles that the user selected, right? So we might say something like, "Hey, this is going to be the selected consoles." Okay. Does that make sense? At the end of the day, once the user has picked the dialog, we're going to have the selected consoles. Okay. What type is that going to be?
Keep it everything the same type, I guess.
Probably. That would make sense, right? We're getting them in as a map. Let's also send them back out as a map, right? So through this process, we're going to be working with maps. Once the user's picked consoles, should this map be null or not null? Well, the users picked consoles, so it shouldn't be null at this point.
Oh, I thought we were going to allow them to pick nothing.
Well, but even if they pick nothing, that's a map where everything is false or
That's
everything
zero.
is null.
Okay.
The keys are null, right? But there still should be a map because the user's now made a selection,
Okay.
even if that selection contains nothing. So this should be, at this point, I want this to be non-null. So now this listener here, on choose listener is an instance of this type down here. Does that make sense? Notice I don't have any index here because there's not really an index per se. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about this implementation. When about our parameters in the constructor,
Mm-hmm.
we've set our two maps to be nullable,
Yep.
which means they could come in as there be no map, period, right?
Yeah, there could. It's true.
So why are we strictly defining that the output map has to be non-null? Why couldn't we
So,
just give it a null?
yeah, let's talk about the selected on both sides, right? When the user comes in, they may not have previously selected consoles. Once this comes out, they should have selected consoles. We want that behavior. We want where what comes in might be null, but what goes out is not null. Leave that, let that sit for a minute. Okay. Does this structure make sense so far as how I'm setting up the kind of the skeleton of it? Okay. And you'll notice where I spend most of the time when I'm creating a class is on the arguments of the constructor. It's on what data do I need first of all to start this process off. Okay. So we've determined that that's the minimum data that I need. Okay. Let's go into, say, there's some stuff I'm going to need to do first. I'll come back to that. And let's talk about building the dialog itself. So building the dialog itself, remember that I need a builder first. So alert dialog builder. Builder is equal to a new alert dialog builder that takes a context. That's the context we've been providing. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to say dialog dot dialog equals builder dot create. Let me put a D in there. Okay. So that process always happens. We make a builder, and then we use the builder to create a dialog. Okay. Between there, we need to set the dialog up, right? So what are the things we need to do? What are the things that we need to call on builder to create the dialog that we want? Let's look at the data we have, right? So start at the top. What's the first argument? We've got context. Okay, we kind of already used the context. Yep.
Let's maybe do set title.
Yeah, so set title would be kind of the first thing I would do, kind of working my way down top to bottom. So set title. And that would be our title. In the middle, right, kind of working our way down the dialog, what I'm going to want to say is set view in some way, shape, or form. Okay, that's how I'm going to put this up in the middle. We haven't created that view yet. That's something we need to come back to. I also want to have some action buttons on there. So set positive action button. And I'm going to use the standard text. So this is going to be android.r.string.ok. And I need some sort of handler for that. If you remember, the handler takes a dialog and an integer called which. Okay, so that's for the OK button. And so when the user presses OK, that's remember where we want to call our callback. Okay, so I'm going to call the listener here that we've got here onChoose. I wish I could just do that as onChoose here, but unfortunately I've got the name of the function in the listener, which is the second part, and the first part onChoose is the name of the variable that I have here. That's why it's onChoose. This first variable name and then the left name. Okay, and from there I want to be able to pass in probably something like this dot selected consoles. Okay, I want to be able to say, hey, let's pass on the selected consoles. Okay, now I've got a bit of a problem there. You'll notice that this is not available. Does everybody see that? Okay, I need an instance variable, right? I need to be able to store what the currently selected consoles are. So I'm going to make that an instance variable up at the top. Private final selected consoles. I'll come back to that a little bit more, but that's what I want to be up there. Right? I want to be able to keep track of what consoles are selected. While I'm paying attention to that, I probably also want to keep track of the consoles that are supported, so maybe I'll add a variable for that as well. I'll put that back up, just knowing that I'm going to need both of those things. I want to have a variable that's storing the supported consoles as well as storing the selected consoles. Okay? So when the user finally presses the positive button, we're going to pass that along. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So what about the negative button? So the negative button, I want to have a cancel builder set negative button android.r that string cancel again dialog and which arrow. Now if the user presses cancel, I don't want to do anything. Because the way I want to set this up is I want to say, okay, ask the user if they want to pick ask user for a console. If the user cancels out of this, we just don't proceed with adding it to the library or adding the wish list or updating the profile. Make sense? So we condition the actual update of the database based on the user completing this, right? If the user doesn't press OK, then the update shouldn't happen. It doesn't get added to their library. Make sense? That means that this listener here on choose listener needs to be where that is. Like add to library, add to wish list, all that code needs to move into that callback. I need to also mention here that that callback should not be null. We need to have some logic to run when the user picks something. Okay, so the only things that can be null are the supported consoles and the selected consoles. So, does that overview make sense in terms of building a dialog out? Okay. What's the thing that's outstanding? Well, the thing that's outstanding is I haven't implemented the actual view itself, the center area. Okay. So what do we need to do for that? Okay. If I review what we talked about on Thursday, and I look back here, creating a custom layout, remember we had to define a layout, and then I had to use the inflator. Start with the inflator. I had to inflate that view, and I had to find the views in there, and then also potentially register some listeners for those buttons. Okay. So I'm going to kind of follow that similar process in how I set this up. So I need to start with the inflator first. So get the inflator. And so layout inflator is equal to layout inflator dot from the context. We will inflate the layout, and so view content view is equal to inflator dot inflate. I need to specify a layout resource, but I have a little bit of a problem in the fact that I don't have a layout yet, right? So I may need to backtrack a little bit and do some resources before I can do this next piece, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a simple layout. I'm going to add a new layout resource, boop, over here. This is kind of a dialogue layout. So we've kind of had activities, we have fragments, we have items. So I might say something like dialogue is one way I could preface it. Or if I'm trying to keep my things more grouped based on features, I might say this is like the console chooser dialog. This is like the console chooser dialog layout. Add it. In there I could define the layout that I wanted. Okay? So for instance, I might want to add some image buttons under here. Drop this in. I'm just going to use my, I think I've got a broken image, yeah, icon there. I'm going to use that. So this is console, I'm going to call this for the moment, I'm going to call this console 1. Or actually, let me just call this, say, like Xbox button. Xbox button factor and another image button. Again, broken PlayStation button. Right, so I want to incorporate a button for every console that user might pick. I'm going to anchor these things real quick. I'm not worrying too much about the layout because you guys can figure that part out. I'm going to bring this down here. So I'm working with a smaller area, and I might want to increase the margin on those. On that as well. Let me put a quick bottom there, bottom right over there, bottom here. One thing I want to do, 8, 8, 8. One thing you'll likely want to do is select them all. Create a chain with them. So I'm going to create a horizontal chain and kind of position them together like this. That's going to make them look a lot better if they're in a horizontal chain. So that's enough to get started with the layout. Let me go back to the design view and maybe so you can kind of see where that is at. So back to blueprint view. Questions so far? Does that kind of make sense in terms of just design the layout like you would an activity or an item? Back here, now that I've got my layout, I can say r.layout console chooser dialog. We can inflate that. Alt enter, bring in view. And so effectively this content view is going to go down here into set view. Right? This inflate also needs a few arguments, so null and false. Null because it doesn't have a parent yet, and we don't want it to attach yet because that will happen later. Effectively, where these two things get filled in, the root and attached to root, that gets filled in at the last line here where we say builder.create. That's where those things get filled in. Okay. So I also need to find the views. So I'd want to be able to find, for instance, button, the Xbox button, content view, find view by ID, r.id, dot Xbox button. Actually, that is a image button. And similarly for the others. And you continue that for any other consoles you have. All right, so set up buttons. That way we've got the basic layout, right? And so that's a starting point. I still need to fill in those two instance variables up at the top. You can see supported consoles and selected consoles up at the instance variables. Those are still in red underline because I haven't assigned them. So up there I still need to say this dot supported consoles is something like supported consoles, and this dot selected consoles is the selected consoles. All right, so I need to do something like that just to appease the instance variables because I marked them final. So by them being final, they have to be assigned somewhere in the constructor. Make sense? Okay. There still should be a red underline somewhere in your code. Do you see it? There still should be an error somewhere in your code. What is that error? And where is it?
So are you talking about the chooser on choose?
Yes.
That's where my error is.
So you should have this, you should still have an error down here that it says argument this dot selected consoles might be null, right? Because remember we did have that distinction where I said, hey, in the constructor selected consoles could be null, but when I call this, I don't want it to be null, okay? So I got a problem I want to resolve there, okay? So that's pretty simple. What I would do is I would just say here, if the selected consoles, if that's null, we're going to do one thing. And otherwise, we're going to do something different. Okay. So in the case where the user hasn't picked any consoles or hasn't picked consoles previously, I want to set that to be something that's not null. Okay? So, easy answer. Let's just say, okay, if it's null, let's just construct a new map, right? If it's null, we're just going to say, hey, at the end of the day, I need a map, so let me just make one. So, sorry, I need to use the subclass. So I'm going to use hash map. There. So we're going to make a new hash map if they haven't selected anything previously. Otherwise, we're going to set it to the consoles they provided. And so that means at the end of the day, when we get to the callback, that's always going to be non-null by solving that problem. Okay. So problem addressed, right? Did that answer your original question of how we're going to tackle it? Okay. Does that make sense? Just say, hey, we're going to end up with a map. Okay. We still have a few things to do, but if we were, this does compile at this point, and I could potentially hook it up to the UI, and it would show that dialog. It just wouldn't provide a way for the user can still click on those buttons, but nothing happens, notice, when the user clicks on those buttons, right? There's no listeners for those buttons. Make sense? There's a listener for the OK button, but there's not a listener for the buttons themselves, the console buttons themselves. So that's one part I need in there, okay? I'm also not doing anything with the supported consoles yet or the selected consoles yet, okay? So if we kind of think about where this is structured, I think I actually put these lines probably in the wrong place because if I put them up here, I don't have the views yet to work with them. So I might want to take this code out and move it down right and sandwich it between here. And deal with what's supported, and then also deal with what's selected. Okay. Now, remember, I said that the supported consoles could be null, right? The supported consoles could be null or could be non-null. So I need to, again, treat those differently, right? So I might say, hey, let's check if the supported is null. If it's null, then we're going to do one thing, and otherwise, we're going to do another thing. Okay. Now, in this case, I'm just going to say that if there's no consoles, if there's no supported, we're just going to leave it as null, because actually at that point we're done, right? Because we've said if the supported consoles is null, then everything is enabled, which it already is by default, right? It's already in our UI, in our layout. We've already enabled all the options. Does that make sense? So we don't actually need to do anything in that first case. In the second case, what I need to do is disable the appropriate buttons, disable the consoles that are not available. Does that make sense? Here I need to disable the consoles that are not available. Okay. So let's talk about just one button. How do I determine if Xbox is supported? How do I figure out if Xbox is supported per the map that we have? Aaron? Checking, well, let's assume that assuming we already got data from the database. This dialog shouldn't do anything with the database. The database should come before this. Should have already gotten that data by now.
Determine if the keys are in the map.
Yes. Okay. So how can I find out if the key is in the map? It's the right answer, but how?
I would say loop, but I don't think you gotta do that.
Yeah, I don't need to do a loop. I don't need to do a loop. So there's two functions on map that are really, really useful. So let's look at those. So supported consoles. Okay. Under there is one. One is called contains key. Contains key will tell you yes or no. It will give you a Boolean to say, is that in the map? Okay, so if it returns true, there is a key for it. If it returns false, that key's not there. Okay? Now, just because the key's there doesn't mean that it's true. It just means it's there. You could have the key and have the key be false. Okay? It just tells you the presence or the absence of that key. You can also have the key be there and the value of it be null. Okay? I still don't know that it's anything other. Okay? So there is some value in using contains key. Like hands down, there are cases where you may want to use this. The other thing I can use is get, which will give me the value of a particular key, and if the key doesn't exist, it will return null. So oftentimes I'll just go straight up and ask for the key and then find out what the value of that key is and check if it's null or treat it as such. Okay? So let's say, what is the key I want to get? Remember, we're dealing with the first console, Xbox, right? So I just want to say, hey, give me my Xbox key. Right? Tell me if that is enabled or not. Does that make sense to everybody?
there is literally what's written in the database.
Yeah, well, because
As the string.
we're going to assume that those maps that we've received have come from the database.
Okay.
Database code's not written here, but that data is coming from the database, right? So yeah, I am presuming that the ID in the database is Xbox. Obviously, I need to change that if I put it in as some other key in the database,
Okay.
right? So that will give us back what type? What does get return?
Turns a boolean.
Okay, Boolean lowercase or uppercase?
Uppercase.
Uppercase because it's actually the value. See, it's not the presence or absence of that key, it's what is the value of that key. So that value right now is a uppercase Boolean. I can call that Xbox, right? So this will be one of three things. This will be true to indicate that it is supported. It will be false to indicate it's not supported, or it will be null if it's not set. So true, false, or null. Part of why we have an uppercase B, okay? Because this could be null, okay? So, let's walk through those. In the case that this is true, should the button be enabled or disabled? If the Xbox is supported for this game, should it be enabled or disabled? Enabled, right? If it's false, it should be disabled. Make sense? What if it's null? Should it be enabled or disabled?
Disabled.
Why do you say that?
Because we should be explicit about how we decide to enable it.
Probably, right?
So,
In fact, I think the way that most of our databases are set up, we only set true for the ones that are there, right? I think a lot of people didn't put false for the consoles that aren't allowed, right? So inherently, we're kind of saying a null is that the console isn't supported, that it's not available on a console. So if there's not a switch entry in there, then it's not on the switch. So the only thing that's treated as enabled is it being true, okay? So basically what I want to say is that I want to say Xbox is true, right? But remember that this could be null, and that's going to crash if it's null. Okay. So remember, if I'm comparing with Booleans, with objects, what method do I use instead of equals equals? Huh?
Oh, wait.
Instead of equals equals, you're going to use dot equals, or objects equals, right? So here, what I want to say is, let's go find it. Let's call objects dot equals, and say, is this true? Boolean true. And that's actually going to make this a lowercase Boolean, because now it's strictly true or false. If I say equals true, then it's either going to come out as true or false. It can't come out as null anymore. Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of what I'm doing as far as processing that? Right? So get is how we access something from the map. Equals is how we compare two objects.
and that's only because we have to deal with the Boolean object and not the Boolean primitive.
Yes. And the Boolean primitive can't be null. The Boolean object can be null.
Okay.
Right? Oftentimes we would call that the boxed type. The uppercase B is known as, the uppercase letter is known as the boxed type. Okay? So then I can say something to the effect of like Xbox button dot set enabled and set that to Xbox. right? So I can do something to that effect. Does that make sense to everybody in terms of enabling and disabling the buttons? So the idea would be if I have it in the database stored as like, hey, these are the ones that are enabled, then only those buttons are going to be enabled based on that. There's just some processing we have to do, right? So I've done one button. What if I want to do all the buttons?
Is it not just copy paste?
I could totally just copy paste, right? That's perfectly valid, actually. I could just copy paste that. That would work for all of them, right? What are my other options? Usually something like this, if you're copying and pasting code, you might want to put it in a loop, right? And effectively what I want to loop is loop over the consoles. I could jerry-rig a way to do that. I would really honestly just recommend you do the copy-paste approach. Because it turns out that you're not going to get that much out of making it into a loop. You might be helpful to make that into one line instead of two. You know, at least to make it a little bit more readable. But I can do that and just repeat that for all the consoles. So again, just under here, repeat for other consoles. So that makes sense in terms of like going about that. It's really not that hard in terms of enabling. You just have to be able to set a Boolean. And it's just a trick of how you get to that Boolean. The only reason I wanted to go through this is because we haven't spent too much time talking about the maps specifically and this get method, and I've seen some people having some struggles with it, as well as just making sure I remind you, hey, you have to deal with nulls. And so yeah, I'm being very explicit about all of those cases. Right? There's a lot of places where we can get null. We can get null about the maps themselves can be null, but also the keys within there can be null as well. Okay? All right, so that's step one. That's kind of talking about the supported consoles. What about the selected consoles? What about this one? What about this side? Well, first of all, remember, null means nothing selected, right? So again, I don't need to do any additional work in the null case. I'm just going to create a new map and we're done. The place where I need to do additional work is if there's already some selected, right? So I can kind of take the same trick, right? We can start reading out what's in there. So I could go to the selected consoles.get, and I could get the Xbox console. Notice I'm in selected consoles instead of supported consoles, right? Again, that will give me a Boolean, right? Which can be null, could be true, false, or null. Right? Could be true, false, or null. Okay. How do we deal with those? Well, true or false are obvious. It's checked based on that. It's based on that state being true or false. What about the null case? What if checked is null? Well, again, I would make the same assumption that null is effectively equivalent to false, right? If it's not been checked, or there's no known state, we're going to assume that it's unchecked. So I would do the same thing where I use objects equals, and I would kind of basically repeat this, the only difference being that we're working with the selected consoles instead of the supported consoles. Now, how do I indicate whether or not a particular console has been selected? How do I indicate that to the user?
So usually you're talking about UI, right?
Yep.
Usually they just set like maybe the background of the button to something else.
Yep, that's one thing I could do. It does depend on what UI elements you've chosen to start with, right? So let's say if I start in, I did here, I chose to start with image buttons, but other options I could have chosen, I could have, for instance, chosen a checkbox, right? If I've got a checkbox, I just need to call set checked and set it to wherever I want it to be, right? If I was using a toggle button, set checked, right? So I could do this anyway, and potentially I could hook this up, the same kind of idea with a toggle button, and that might be more connected as well, right? I just wanted to mention, well, what can we do here in this image button case? Well, yes, one thing I could do is I could change the color of the background, right? I could change the color of the background. Remember that if you're looking in the designer and you're looking at backgrounds, remember that there is a background and a background tint. There's a background and a background tint. If you change the background, you're actually changing the entire look of the button, right? The background on the button was actually what makes it look like a button. So if I replace the background, it's going to no longer look like a button. Does that make sense? So what I actually want to change is the background tint, which just changes the color of said button. Make sense? Background tint and not background. So if I look at here, let's see, Xbox button, set background. Okay. Tint is kind of weird. Does everybody see this? See my drop down? See my options? So I can set the background to a drawable, I can set it to a color, I can set it to a resource. But all three of those, set background, set background color, and set resource, all of those are changing the background itself. Those are changing the background itself. Okay. If we do those, we're going to lose the shape of the button, and we're going to lose any animations that go with the button, right? So I want to set the tint. So what are my options? Tint blend mode, tint list, tint mode. Fortunately, the API for Java is not really it's not really close to what the API is in the XML.
It's gotta be tint blend mode.
Why do you say that?
Oh, maybe not. I don't know.
So there's three
They all
functions
suck.
that they do different things. Okay, that's the first and foremost things to understand, is they do very different things. Okay, so the blend mode changes how the tint is applied to the background. Okay, I want to just change the color, right? That's not going to change the color. Okay, what about tint mode? Again, not going to change the thing I want. So unfortunately, the thing you have to set is this one. If I want to change the background tint, I need to change the background tint list. Notice that this takes some object called a color state list. Does everybody see that? Color state list. So the reason that this is a newer sort of API. Basically, the dealio is that you might want the tint to be different based on the state of the button. That's what it's allowing you to do. So the tint might be different based on whether the button's enabled or disabled, or checked or unchecked, or pressed or not pressed, right? So that it gives you this kind of state list that we have to kind of build up if we want to change it. What I would recommend you do is take a quick look on Google. See if you can find an answer to how to create that color state list. This is kind of a common problem that you run into. It's like, hey, I just want to set it to a specific color, right? But apparently I need a color state list for that. So how can I get a color state list? So that's one option. Keep looking. See if there's some other options to do it strictly with cut. There are ways to set this up with XML, but I would want to avoid adding a bunch of XML resources. If the XML is interesting, I might do it. See that example is pretty good. But we can do something simpler than that. I think kind of table into the prototype. Because we always want to, because we just need to get more complicated. So obviously it's still something you're kind of researching. That's something I want you to do, right? I'm going to let you do that research about how to do that, how to change the color there. But the idea is I want you to change it to one color if it's selected and another color if it is unselected, right? One background color if it's selected and different background tint, different background color if it is not. The other thing I would want to do to make it more obvious about what is actually there is I would also recommend calling set image resource and setting it to one icon if it's checked or not checked. So we can do two things together to make it the effect more obvious. We can change the color and simultaneously change the icon. So I'd use like a solid icon style and maybe a filled in icon style kind of thing. So, or you could use maybe the unselected is a black and white PlayStation icon, and then it's a colored PlayStation icon when you select it. Does that make sense? So I would want to switch both of these two things over based on it being checked. Okay? So that's what I want you to do here. And that would continue for your other consoles. I want to talk about one thing here, which is we also need to register some listeners. Okay. This code above is just looking at what the state is initially and getting the UI to show it. But I also need to be able to click on the button itself and that change the state. Does that make sense? So let's say I want to go again to the Xbox button. Okay? So for the Xbox button, I want to set an on-click listener. Okay. When you click on it, I first need to determine what state it's currently in, right? I need to determine, is it checked or is it unchecked, right? I can do that kind of like I did up here by just looking into the current map and getting the value out. So I might want to say like this dot selected consoles dot get Xbox particularly, right? One of the things I have to watch out for here, I need to make sure I'm referring to this dot consoles in this dot selected instead of just selected, because remember here it might come in as null. These might be different, right? So at this point here, it's one story here. This really does need to be this dot selected. Same way I did above, we can say objects dot equals, and we can say, hey, it's checked if that is true. Does that make sense? So in all of those cases, I'm treating null as false. Okay? All right. So once I've got the status of it, remember when you click on it, I want it to toggle it. I want to alternate between checked and unchecked. How do I update the map with the new state? How do I update the map with the new state? Well, obviously it's going to start with this dot selected consoles because that's the thing I need to update. Okay. So anybody know which method I need to use to set a key or update a key within a map? We've done this before.
Is it replace?
Not quite. Michael? Nothing? Huh?
Put?
Yeah, put. So remember we've used this a few times with like extras, bundles. We've worked with inserting data into Firebase, and Firebase we put things in as a map. So I need to put the key, so it'd be like Xbox, and it would be, I need to put it the opposite of what it is, so not checked. Right? So get the current state out, and then set it back to the opposite of whatever it is right now. Right? And then it's just a matter of doing what you had done before, of updating the state to what it needs to be at this point. Does that kind of make sense? Give you some pointers as to how to set these things up? Okay. So those kind of code is going to be very similar to what you have here, and then that would be for all of the other consoles. So there's a few places where you're going to have to say, hey, do this for every console. Okay? That's where I'm going to leave you. So you've got kind of a skeleton, a template, a starting point of like what I'm looking for. You kind of understand the structure of it and why. So I want you to build that out, and then you're going to use it in the different places we talked about. Cool? You can see why you might want to have this as a separate class, right? Because there's going to be enough code in here by the time you're done that you wouldn't want to repeat this again and again and again.